Humans always beg, she said, her voice low and certain, the kind of certainty that came from never being proven wrong, and the blade in her hand hummed inches from my throat, close enough that I could feel the heat ripple across my skin like standing too near an open furnace on a winter night. The air around us thick with the metallic tang of burnt circuitry and charged dust, my lungs pulling in dry, biting breaths as the storm rolled over the shattered plain in slow, electric waves. But I didn't move, didn't reach for the sidearm at my hip, didn't even flinch when her shadow fell across my face, because something in her eyes wasn't just anger, it was expectation, like she was waiting for me to confirm everything she believed about my kind. So I smiled instead, a small, tired thing that tasted like iron and old regrets, and said, "Easy, you're safe." And that was when the world shifted. Not outside where the wind howled and lightning crawled across the horizon in jagged veins of blue, but right there in the space between us, because she froze, just for a second, her grip tightening not in attack, but in hesitation, her glowing eyes narrowing as if trying to focus on something that wasn't in front of her, but buried somewhere deeper, and I saw it then. That flicker, that fracture in the perfect armor of a warrior who had never questioned her place in the universe. And I realized she didn't understand why I wasn't afraid, why I wasn't fighting, why I wasn't giving her the ending she expected. The storm cracked louder, a rolling thunder that shook the ground beneath us, grains of sand lifting into the air like a rising tide, stinging against my face, my jacket snapping in the wind as the temperature dropped fast enough to make my breath fog. And still she didn't move, didn't strike, didn't speak, just stared at me like I was something impossible. Something that didn't fit, and for a moment, neither of us were enemies, just two figures caught in the middle of a dying battlefield that had already taken too much, and I could feel the seconds slipping, the kind that decide whether you walk away or get buried in the dust. But I didn't rush her, didn't break whatever fragile thread had formed, because instincts like hers didn't hesitate without a reason, and whatever she thought she saw in my face, it mattered, even if I didn't understand it yet. And then her lips parted slightly, just enough for a breath to escape, not a threat, not a command, but something quieter, almost uncertain, like a memory trying to surface through noise. And in that moment I knew this wasn't over, not even close, because whatever she recognized, it wasn't me, not the man I remembered being, and somehow, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The wind hit harder, a low roaring pressure that bent the horizon into a blur of shifting light and sand, and for a second I thought she might actually let me go, but then her grip steadied again, not tighter, just controlled, like she was recalibrating instead of reacting, her weapon still hovering near my throat, but no longer trembling with intent, and that was new, that kind of hesitation. It did not belong to someone who had survived as long as she clearly had. I could hear it in her. Breathing too, slower now, measured, like she was forcing herself back into the role she understood, the role where I was the enemy and she was the one in control. "You speak as if you know me," she said, her voice quieter than before, less edge, more weight, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, the cold air stinging my lungs as I shifted just enough to sit up, not fast, not threatening, careful, always careful, because something fragile had opened, and I did not want to be the one to break it. "I do not," I answered, brushing dust from my sleeve as the storm thickened around us. Visibility dropping to maybe 20 feet, maybe less, the world shrinking into a narrow tunnel of static and light. "But you look like someone who has been told humans are monsters." I glanced at her, just briefly, then away again, giving her space she did not ask for. "Figured I would disappoint you." She did not respond right away, and that silence stretched, filled with the hiss of charged particles scraping across metal and fabric, until finally she lowered the weapon a few inches, not enough to trust, but enough to breathe, her eyes still locked on my face like she was trying to pull something out of it that refused to surface. "You are not afraid," she said, almost accusing, and I shrugged slightly, feeling the ache in my shoulders from too many days without rest. "Being afraid does not change the outcome," I replied. "It just makes the wait worse." Another flash of light tore across the sky, closer this time, the ground humming faintly beneath our feet, and I knew we were running out of time. The storm was not just weather, it was interference. Energy spikes that could fry anything not shielded, including the fragile balance we were standing in. I pushed myself to my feet slowly, hands visible, movements deliberate. "We need cover," I said, nodding toward a half-buried structure barely visible through the haze about 30 yards out, its silhouette flickering in and out like a ghost. "You can keep the weapon on me if that helps." A pause, then she rose too, fluid and precise despite the shifting ground, her posture still that of a warrior, but her eyes were different now, searching instead of judging. And as we started moving, the wind screaming louder around us, I felt it again, that strange pull in the back of my mind, like a memory trying to surface and failing, something about the way she watched me, the way her steps matched mine without thinking, like we had done this before. Like this was not the first time we had walked side by side through a storm neither of us fully understood, and that thought should have meant nothing. But it lingered, heavy and unresolved, as if the truth was just one breath away from being remembered, and neither of us were ready for it. The structure loomed closer through the storm, its jagged outline cutting against flashes of blue light that rippled across the sky like distant waves, and with every step the ground shifted under our boots, fine particles lifting and swirling in sharp, stinging currents that scraped against exposed skin and fabric, the air tasting metallic, charged, alive in a way that made the back of my neck tighten with quiet warning. I reached the half-collapsed entrance first, brushing aside a hanging sheet of warped alloy that groaned softly at the touch, and stepped inside where the wind dropped from a roar to a low, constant hum, the kind that settled into your bones instead of your ears. She followed a second later, her presence filling the space without a sound, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us thicker than the storm outside, broken only by the faint ticking of cooling metal and the distant crackle of energy beyond the walls. I moved deeper into the structure, scanning by instinct more than necessity, eyes adjusting to the dim interior where faint emergency strips flickered along the floor, casting thin lines of pale light that reflected off dust suspended in the air like frozen ash. "This place will hold for a while," I said quietly, setting my pack down near what looked like an intact support column. "Storm will pass in an hour, maybe two." She did not lower her weapon, but she did not raise it either, her stance easing just enough to show she was thinking instead of reacting, and that alone told me more than anything she could have said. "You speak as if you have survived many of these," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the hollow space, softer now, less sharpened by certainty. I gave a small shrug as I checked the wall integrity with a light tap, the dull thud confirming it was still solid enough, long enough to know when not to stand outside. I replied, then reached for a small canteen at my side, unscrewing the cap and taking a measured sip before setting it down between us on the metal floor, not offering it directly, just leaving it there, an option instead of a gesture. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me, suspicion still present but no longer dominant. "You expect me to accept this?" she asked, and there was something beneath the words now, not just doubt but confusion, as if the concept itself did not align with anything she had been taught. "No," I answered simply, settling back against the support column, keeping my movements slow, deliberate. "I expect you to decide for yourself." The hum of the storm deepened outside, a low vibration that traveled through the structure and into the floor beneath us, and for a moment it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. She stepped forward then, just one pace, lowering her weapon another inch as her gaze dropped briefly to the canteen, then lifted again. To my face, studying, searching, that same flicker returning, stronger this time, like a signal trying to break through interference. "You speak." "The same," she said slowly, almost to herself, and something in the way she said it made a quiet tension coil in my chest. Not fear, not exactly, just a sense that we were standing on the edge of something neither of us fully understood. I frowned slightly, not in challenge, but in genuine confusion. "Same as who?" I asked, and she went still again. Not like before with the weapon raised and ready, but like someone caught between two realities, one she knew and one she could not yet accept. Her grip tightening slightly as her eyes traced the lines of my face as if memorizing them, comparing them to something unseen, something buried, and for a moment I almost asked again, almost pushed, but instinct told me not to. because whatever answer she was searching for, it was not something that could be forced into the open. It had to surface on its own, and until then, all I could do was sit there in the dim light, the storm pressing against the walls, and feel the weight of a past I did not remember slowly closing in around us. The storm pressed harder against the walls, a deep, vibrating pressure that turned the air thick and electric, and the faint lights along the floor flickered in uneven pulses, casting shifting shadows across her face as she stood there, still as a statue, yet somehow more tense than before. Like every instinct she had was trying to pull her in two directions at once. I watched her carefully without staring, the way you do when you know sudden movement matters more than words, and after a long moment she finally lowered her weapon completely, not dropping it, not relaxing, just removing the immediate threat, and that alone felt louder than anything she had said so far. "You are not what I was told," she said, her voice quieter now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried before, and I let out a slow breath, leaning my head back against the cold metal behind me, feeling the chill seep through the fabric of my jacket, grounding me. "Most things are not," I replied, glancing toward the entrance where flashes of light bled through the gaps in the structure, the storm still raging but slightly less violent than before. "Stories are easier than truth." She took another step closer, cautious but deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine, and there it was again, that searching look, not hostile, not curious in a simple way, but something deeper, something that carried weight. "Where did you learn that phrase?" she asked, and the question caught me off guard more than anything else she had said. I frowned slightly, running a hand across the back of my neck as I thought, the motion automatic, familiar. "I do not know," I admitted after a second. "It just sounds right." She inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling in a controlled rhythm, but I could see the tension beneath it, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the grip of her weapon even though she was no longer aiming it. "You said it before," she whispered, almost like she was afraid the words might break if she spoke them too loudly, and something in my chest shifted at that, a quiet, uncomfortable awareness that I could not place, like standing in a room you recognize but cannot remember entering. "People say a lot of things," I said, though my voice lacked the certainty it had a moment ago, and she shook her head once, slow and firm. "Not like that." The lights flickered again, dimming for a second before returning, and in that brief shadow her expression changed, not into anger or suspicion, but something closer to vulnerability, something that did not belong on a battlefield. "You said it when the sky was burning," she continued, her gaze distant now, focused somewhere beyond me. "When everything was collapsing and the ground would not stop shaking." I stayed still, listening, because whatever she was describing, it was not happening here, not now, and yet the way she spoke made it feel real, immediate, like the past was bleeding into the present through her voice. "I was smaller," she said, her tone softening further. "I did not understand why I was alone." A faint pulse of light rolled through the structure as the storm shifted again, and I felt that same pressure build behind my eyes, that same almost memory trying to surface. "You knelt in front of me," she added, and now her voice trembled just slightly, barely noticeable, but there. "You did not reach for your weapon. You did not look at me like I was something to fear." My breath caught for a fraction of a second, something tightening in my chest as images I could not quite see brushed against the edges of my mind, fleeting, incomplete. "You said those words," she finished, her eyes locking onto mine again, sharper now, more certain. "Easy. You are safe." Silence followed, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant rumble outside, and I realized then that whatever she remembered, whatever she believed she had found in me, it was not a question to her anymore. It was an answer, and the only problem was, I did not remember giving it. The silence did not break right away. It settled instead, heavy and deliberate, like the structure itself was holding its breath with us, and I could feel her eyes on me, not sharp like before, not measuring threat, but searching for something that should have been there and was not. And I ran my tongue along the inside of my cheek, tasting dust, and something else, something faintly metallic that did not belong to the air, because whatever she had just said, it should have meant something. It should have unlocked something, but all I felt was that same hollow pressure behind my eyes, like a door I could not quite reach. "I do not remember," I said finally. The words quiet but steady, not defensive, not dismissive, just honest, and that seemed to hit her harder than anything else, not physically, but in the way her posture shifted, just slightly, like a piece of ground she thought was solid had given way beneath her. You should, she replied, and there was no anger in it, only certainty, and something else underneath that I could not name, something fragile. I exhaled slowly, pushing myself up from the support column and stepping a few feet away, needing the space to think, to breathe, the faint light catching on the edges of broken panels and casting long, thin shadows across the floor. There are a lot of things I should remember, I said, glancing back at her. Does not mean I do. The storm outside shifted again, a low rolling vibration that made the structure creak softly, dust falling in thin streams from the ceiling, and for a moment neither of us spoke, caught between what was known and what was missing. You carried me, she said after a while, her voice quieter now, almost careful, like she was choosing each word with precision. I could not walk, I could barely see, and the air was burning. Her gaze drifted slightly, unfocused, as if she was watching it happen again. You wrapped me in something warm, something that smelled like smoke and metal. I frowned slightly, a faint sensation brushing against my thoughts. Not an image, not a memory, just a feeling, like warmth against cold, like weight in my arms, gone as quickly as it came. You kept speaking, she continued, her voice steadying as she held onto the thread of it. Not to command, not to threaten, just to keep me awake. I shifted my weight, the floor humming faintly beneath my boots, that pressure building again, sharper this time, and I closed my eyes for a second, trying to catch whatever it was before it slipped away, but it did, leaving nothing but that same empty space. That sounds like someone else, I said quietly, opening my eyes again, and for the first time since we met, something in her expression faltered completely, not anger, not suspicion, but something closer to disbelief, like she was realizing that whatever she had carried all this time might not be as simple as she thought. No, she said, shaking her head once, more firmly now. It was you. I held her gaze for a moment, then looked away, not because I could not face it, but because I did not know how to. Then I guess I forgot, I replied, and the words felt heavier than they should have, like they carried weight I could not see. She stepped closer then, just within arm's reach, and I did not move, did not pull away, because whatever this was, it was not something distance would fix. My people do not forget faces, she said, her voice steady again, but quieter, more controlled. Not ones that change our fate. The lights flickered once more, dimming the space until only her eyes seemed to hold any brightness, and I realized then that whatever I had done, whatever moment she was holding on to, it had not been small to her. It had not been just another day, and that thought settled into my chest with a quiet, unfamiliar weight, because if she was right, then somewhere in a past I could not remember, I had mattered more than I ever intended to. The weight of her words did not fade when the silence returned. It stayed there, settled somewhere deeper than thought, pressing in with a quiet persistence that made it hard to ignore, and I found myself looking at her differently now, not as a threat, not even as a stranger, but as someone carrying a version of me I did not recognize, and that was a strange kind of unease, not sharp, not urgent, just steady, like a question that refused to leave. If I mattered that much, I said slowly, my voice low in the dim hum of the structure, why did you come at me like I was nothing? Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in something more complex, something layered, because that is what humans become, she answered, and there was history in that sentence, not just belief. We're taught us that. I let out a quiet breath, glancing toward the flickering light strips along the floor, watching them pulse in uneven rhythm. War teaches a lot of things, I said, most of them wrong. She did not respond immediately, and I could see the conflict there again, the push and pull between what she had lived through and what stood in front of her now. You were different, she said after a moment, her voice softer. You did not look at me like I was the enemy. I gave a small, almost humorless smile, shaking my head slightly. Maybe I just got tired of deciding who was. The words came out easier than I expected, like they had been sitting there waiting, and for a second I wondered if that was part of what she remembered, not the exact moment, but the way I thought, the way I chose. The storm outside began to ease, the violent edge of it dulling into a steady, distant rumble, and the structure around us stopped trembling quite as much, the air losing some of that sharp, charged bite. "When the storm clears," she said, her tone shifting back towards something more grounded, more present, "we will go separate ways." I nodded once, because that was the logical outcome, the expected one, but something about it did not sit as cleanly as it should have, probably for the best, I replied, though my voice lacked conviction. She studied me for a moment longer, then finally moved to the side, lowering herself carefully onto a piece of fallen paneling, her posture still controlled but no longer rigid, and for the first time since we met, there was space between us that did not feel like a battlefield, just two people waiting out a storm. "What is your name?" she asked, and the question felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more meaning now, more consequence. "Ethan," I said after a second. "Ethan Cole." She repeated it quietly, testing the sound of it, committing it to memory, and something in the way she said it made that same pressure build again in the back of my mind, sharper this time, closer, like something just on the edge of breaking through. "Ethan," she said again, more certain now, and then she looked up at me, really looked this time, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. "I am Kalira," she added, and the name settled between us, simple and steady, and I nodded once, acknowledging it. "Kalira," I repeated, and for a moment the world outside did not matter, the storm, the war, the distance between our kinds, none of it, just that quiet exchange, two names in the dim light of a broken structure, and yet beneath it, something was shifting, something neither of us had fully grasped yet, because the past she carried and the past I had lost were not done with us, not even close, and I could feel it in the air, in the way her gaze lingered just a second longer than necessary, in the way my thoughts refused to settle, like the storm had not ended at all, it had just moved inside, waiting for the moment it would rise again. The storm began to thin into a distant, restless whisper, the kind that lingered in the air long after its force had passed, and the faint light filtering through the cracks in the structure grew steadier, less frantic, casting a pale glow that softened the sharp edges of everything around us. I pushed myself off the support column and stepped toward the entrance, stopping just short of the threshold where the outside world came back into view. The horizon still hazy but no longer violent, just a slow drift of dust carried on cooling winds. "It is clearing," I said quietly, more to mark the moment than to state the obvious, and behind me I heard the faint shift of metal as Kalira stood, her movements as controlled as ever, but no longer carrying that same immediate readiness to strike. "Yes," she replied, and there was something in her tone that made the word feel heavier than it should have, like it meant more than just the weather. I glanced back at her, and for a second neither of us moved, caught in that strange space between what we were supposed to be and what had already changed. "You can leave first," I offered, stepping slightly to the side, giving her a clear path out. No reason to risk crossing paths again. It was practical, simple, the kind of decision that made sense in a world built on conflict, but she did not move, did not even look toward the exit, her gaze fixed on me instead, steady and unblinking. "You still do not remember," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement. I shook my head once, the motion small but final. "No," I answered, and the word felt heavier this time, like it carried something I was starting to regret. She studied me for another moment, then finally took a step forward, not toward the exit, but toward me, closing the distance I had just created, and that alone was enough to shift something in the air again, subtle but undeniable. "Then I will remember for both of us," she said, her voice calm, grounded, and there was a quiet strength in it that did not come from dominance, but from choice. I held her gaze, not challenging, not retreating, just present, and for a moment it felt like the world had narrowed again, not into danger, but into something more focused, more deliberate. "That sounds like a heavy job," I said, a faint trace of something almost like humor in my voice, though it did not quite reach my eyes. She did not smile, but something in her expression softened just slightly, enough to show that the edge between us was no longer what it had been. "It is," she replied, "but it is mine." The wind outside shifted again, lighter now, carrying a cooler breath into the structure, brushing against my face and clearing away the last of the storm's bite, and I turned toward the opening once more, stepping out onto the uneven ground beyond. The sky above still streaked with fading energy, but opening slowly into something clearer, something calmer. I took a few steps forward before stopping, sensing rather than hearing that she had followed, her presence just behind and to the side, close enough to matter, far enough to choose. "This is where we part," I said, looking out over the landscape, the remains of the battlefield stretching into the distance, quieter now, almost still. She did not answer right away, and when I glanced back, I saw that same look again, not searching this time, not questioning, but holding, like she was committing something to memory. "You said that before too," she said softly, and something in my chest tightened at that. Not pain, not fear, just that same quiet pressure building again, stronger now, closer. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head just a little. "I guess I am predictable," I replied, trying to keep the moment light, but it did not land the way it used to. Not with her, not now. She stepped closer again, just enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence against the cooling air, and for a second neither of us spoke, the silence no longer heavy, just full, like something waiting, and then she said it, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, certain. "You told me to keep walking." And the words hit differently, not because of what they meant, but because of how they felt, like they belonged somewhere I could not reach. And I realized then that whatever this was, whatever we had been to each other once, it was not finished, not yet. And as the last echoes of the storm faded into the distance, something else took its place, something quieter, but far more persistent. The sense that walking away would not end this. It would only delay what was already beginning to return. The wind had settled into a slow, steady breath across the broken terrain, carrying fine trails of dust that drifted low along the ground like fading echoes of something much louder, and I started walking without thinking, boots pressing into the softened surface with a dull, measured rhythm, one step after another, the kind of movement that came from habit more than decision. But after only a few yards I realized I could still feel her behind me, not just hear her presence, but feel it, like a second pulse in the quiet, and that alone was enough to make me stop, exhaling slowly as I turned just slightly, not fully, just enough to confirm what I already knew. She had not left. Kalira stood there a few feet back, her posture upright, but no longer rigid, her weapon lowered completely now, resting at her side instead of between us, and her eyes were still on me, steady, unwavering, not in challenge, not in suspicion, but in something far more difficult to ignore. "You were supposed to walk away," I said, my voice calm, not accusing, just stating what should have happened. She tilted her head slightly, the motion subtle but deliberate, as if considering the idea itself rather than the words. "So were you," she replied, and there was something almost quiet in her tone, not defiance, not agreement, just truth. I let out a faint breath. That might have been a laugh if it had more weight behind it, shaking my head slightly as I turned to face her fully now, the open sky behind her stretching wide and pale, streaked with the last remnants of the storm's energy. "I have places to be," I said, though even as I spoke the words, they felt thinner than they should have, less anchored. She took a step closer, not closing the distance completely, but enough that it mattered. Enough that the space between us no longer felt like separation. "And yet you stopped," she said, and again, not a challenge, just an observation, one that landed more accurately than I expected. I glanced past her for a moment, toward the distant outline of broken structures scattered across the horizon, trying to remember what direction I had been heading, what purpose had been guiding me before all of this. But the answer did not come, not clearly, just a vague sense of movement without meaning, and that unsettled me more than anything else. "So far, you should go," I said after a second, bringing my focus back to her. "Your people will be looking for you." She did not respond right away, and when she finally did, her voice was quieter than before. "They already found me once." There was weight in that sentence, something unspoken that lingered just beneath it, and I did not press, did not ask, because I understood enough to know that some answers came with costs neither of us were ready to pay yet. "Then you should not be here," I said, more firmly this time, and she nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the logic, but her feet did not move, her gaze did not shift. "No, she agreed softly. I should not. The wind picked up just a little, brushing past us in a cool sweep that carried the last of the storm's scent away, leaving the air clearer, sharper, and in that clarity, everything felt more defined, more real, the distance between us, the choice in front of us, the past that refused to stay buried. I took a step back, giving her space again, the instinct automatic, protective, not just for myself, but for whatever this was becoming. Kalira, I said, her name steady on my tongue now, familiar in a way that still did not make sense. Whatever you think I was, I am not that person anymore. She watched me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then, slowly, she shook her head, not in denial, but in quiet certainty. You are wrong, she said, her voice calm, grounded in something deeper than memory. You are exactly that person. The words settled between us, simple and undeniable, and for the first time since this began, I did not have an answer, because something in the way she said it, something in the way it felt, made it harder to dismiss than I wanted it to be. And as the last traces of the storm faded completely into silence, I realized that walking away was no longer the simple choice it had been before, because whatever I had forgotten, it had not forgotten me. The air felt different now, cleaner but heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the storm, and I stood there facing her, the silence between us no longer empty, but filled with something neither of us could step around, her words still settling into place like they belonged there, like they had always belonged there. And I found myself searching her face again, not for answers this time, but for proof, for something that could anchor what she was saying to something real, something I could hold on to. But all I saw was certainty, not blind, not forced, just steady, like she had carried this truth too long to question it now. You keep saying that, I said quietly, my voice slower than before, more deliberate. Like it is not even a possibility, like it is fact. She did not hesitate, did not look away. Because it is, she answered, and there was no arrogance in it, no challenge, just a calm that made it harder to argue against. I let out a breath and looked down at my hands for a second, flexing my fingers slightly as if they might remember something my mind could not. But they did not. They felt the same, worn, steady, nothing special, nothing worth remembering. Then tell me something I would not know, I said, lifting my gaze back to hers, something only that version of me would have done. Her expression shifted slightly, not uncertainty, but consideration, like she was choosing carefully, not because she lacked answers, but because she understood what they might mean. You refused to leave, she said after a moment, and the words landed softly, but carried weight. I frowned slightly, waiting, and she stepped a little closer, her voice lowering just enough that it felt more personal, more focused. There were others, she continued, your own kind, calling for you to return, telling you the area was not safe, that you had done enough. Something in my chest tightened at that, faint, distant, like a memory brushing against the edges of thought. But you stayed, she said, her eyes steady on mine, because I was still there. The wind moved lightly across the ground, lifting small spirals of dust that faded almost as quickly as they formed, and I felt that pressure again, sharper now, more insistent. That does not sound smart, I said, though my voice lacked its usual edge. She tilted her head slightly, and for the first time there was the faintest hint of something almost like understanding in her expression. It was not, she replied, but it was right. The words lingered, simple, direct, and they hit deeper than they should have, not because I remembered them, but because they felt familiar, like something I would have said, something I might still believe, even if I could not place where it came from. I looked away for a moment, toward the horizon where the last traces of the storm had finally disappeared, leaving the sky open and still, and I realized that the world looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I had, or maybe because I was starting to see something I had been missing. You keep talking about what I did, I said slowly, turning back to her. But you have not said why it matters now. Her gaze softened just slightly, not losing its strength, but gaining something else. Something quieter. Because I became who I am because of it, she answered, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt, just truth. Everything I chose after that moment started there. I held her gaze, feeling the weight of that settle in, not as pressure this time, but as something else, something heavier, something closer to responsibility, even if I did not remember earning it. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence no longer uncertain, just real, and then she took one more step forward, closing the distance completely, not threatening, not demanding, just present. So if you do not remember, she said quietly, then I will remind you. And something in the way she said it, something in the steadiness of it, made it clear that this was not about the past anymore. It was about what came next, and for the first time since this began, I realized that whatever path I thought I was on, it had already changed. The moment she said it, something shifted in the air between us, not like the storm from before, not loud or violent, but deeper, quieter, like a pressure change you only notice when it is already happening. And I felt it in my chest before I understood it, that sense that whatever came next was not something I could just walk away from. I looked at her, really looked this time, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as someone who had carried a version of me longer than I had carried myself. And that thought settled heavy, uncomfortable in a way that did not come from fear, but from responsibility. Remind me how, I said finally, my voice steady but lower than before, stripped of the edge it once held. She did not answer right away, her eyes searching mine, not for doubt, but for permission, and after a second she nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself. You told me to stand, she began, her voice calm but distant, like she was walking through it again step by step. Not because I could, but because you believed I would. I felt that pressure again, sharper now, not painful, but insistent, like something pushing against a barrier inside my mind. You said that strength was not something given, she continued. It was something chosen, one step at a time. My breath slowed without me meaning it to, my focus narrowing as the words settled in, because they did not feel foreign, they did not feel like something someone else would say, they felt familiar. And I told you that I could not, she added, her gaze steady, unbreaking. And you said that did not matter. The wind moved lightly across the open ground, carrying a faint warmth now instead of the cold bite from before, and for a moment everything seemed quieter, clearer, like the world itself was listening. You stayed until I did, she said, and something in my chest tightened again, stronger this time. A flicker of something just out of reach, like a shadow moving behind glass. You should not have, I said softly, almost to myself, because even without remembering, I understood the risk in that choice. She shook her head once, firm. That is what I believed too, she replied, until I realized it was the only reason I am still here. The words landed differently than anything else she had said, not as a memory, but as a consequence, something that had shaped everything that came after, and I felt it then, not the memory itself, but the weight of it, the impact of a moment I did not remember having, but that had mattered enough to change someone else's entire path. I looked down briefly, my hand brushing against my jacket as if searching for something I could not name, then back up at her. And now what? I asked, because that was the part that mattered, not what had been, but what came next. She held my gaze, unwavering, her expression steady but no longer guarded. Now you decide if that was who you are, or just who you were. The question settled between us, quiet but impossible to ignore. And for a moment I did not answer, not because I did not want to, but because I did not know how, because the man she described, the one who stayed, who believed, who chose, he sounded like someone I would want to be, but wanting and remembering were not the same thing. And I could feel that distance, that gap between who I was now and who she believed I had been. And it was not small, it was not simple. It was something that would take more than a single moment to bridge. I exhaled slowly, lifting my gaze to meet hers again, the quiet stretching between us as the last of the storm disappeared completely into the horizon, leaving only stillness behind. I do not remember being that person, I said honestly, but I understand why he mattered, and that was the closest I could come to the truth, for now. She studied me for a long moment, then gave a slight nod, not disappointed, not relieved, just accepting, as if she understood that this was not the end of the question, just the beginning of the answer. And as we stood there in the quiet aftermath, I realized that whatever path I chose next, it would not just define me, it would decide whether the man she remembered was truly gone, or simply waiting to be found again. The quiet did not feel empty anymore. It felt like a space waiting to be filled, and I stood there with her words still echoing somewhere deeper than thought. Not loud, not demanding, just present, like they had settled into place whether I accepted them or not. And for the first time since this began, I did not look for a way out of it. I looked at her instead, at the steadiness in her posture, the way she carried herself not like someone who needed answers, but like someone who had already chosen her path. And I realized that was the difference between us now. She had built her life on a moment she never forgot, and I had built mine by walking away from moments I could not remember. You said I have to decide, I said slowly, my voice quieter than before, more grounded. But what if it is not about remembering? She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as she considered that, not dismissing it, not accepting it, just listening. Then what is it about? She asked, and there was no challenge in her tone, just curiosity, real and unguarded. I took a slow breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, steady, clear, nothing like the charged pressure from before, and for a moment I focused on that, on the simplicity of it, the present, not the past, not the future, just the choice in front of me. Maybe it is about choosing the same thing again, I said, and the words felt right the moment they left my mouth. Not because I remembered saying them before, but because they fit. They aligned with something deeper than memory, something that did not need to be recalled to exist. She watched me closely, and I could see it in her expression, that shift, that recognition, not of the past, but of the person standing in front of her now. You would choose to stay, she said, not as a question, but as a quiet realization. I glanced past her briefly, toward the horizon, toward the open path that would take me away from this place, away from her, away from everything that was starting to surface. And for a second it would have been easy, simple, familiar, but that weight in my chest did not let me ignore it anymore. If it mattered then, I said, bringing my gaze back to hers, steady now, then it matters now. The words settled between us, not dramatic, not loud, just clear, and something in her posture shifted, not into relief, not into triumph, but into something quieter, something that looked a lot like understanding. You do not even know what you are staying for, she said, and there was no doubt in her voice, just truth. I gave a small nod, accepting that. No, I answered, but I know what walking away feels like. And that was enough, more than enough, because it was not about the details anymore. It was about the choice itself, the kind of choice that defined everything that came after it. She held my gaze for a long moment, then slowly inclined her head, not in submission, not in command, just acknowledgement. Then you are still him, she said quietly, and this time, the words did not feel like something I had to reject or question. They felt possible, and that was new. That was something I had not expected when this began. I exhaled slowly, the tension I had been carrying easing just slightly, not gone, but lighter, like something had shifted into place. Then I guess you are not remembering for both of us anymore, I said, and there was a faint trace of something softer in my voice now, something that had not been there before. She did not smile, not fully, but there was a subtle change in her expression, something warmer, something less guarded. No, she replied. Now we both are. And the words stayed there, simple and steady. As the light from above grew stronger, the sky finally clear, the world around us quiet and open again, but different now, not because anything had changed out there, but because something had changed here, between us, and for the first time, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The light settled across the landscape in a way that made everything feel sharper, more defined, as if the world had been washed clean by the storm and left with nothing to hide behind. And I stood there beside her, not moving, not rushing forward or stepping back, just present in a way I had not allowed myself to be in a long time. And it felt unfamiliar at first, that stillness, that awareness, but it did not feel wrong. Kalira shifted slightly beside me, her gaze moving across the horizon, scanning out of habit. But there was no immediate tension in her stance anymore, no urgency to leave or to strike, just a quiet readiness that felt balanced, and that was new, for both of us. If you stay, she said after a moment, her voice calm but carrying that same grounded weight it had before, then you will be seen as one of us. I glanced at her briefly, catching the subtle shift in her expression, the way her eyes reflected not just caution, but consideration, and that is a problem. I replied, not as a question, because I already understood enough to know that it would be. She gave a small nod, her gaze returning to the distance, for both sides. She added, and there was no bitterness in it, just fact. I let out a slow breath, feeling the air move steady through my chest, and for a moment I considered the path ahead, the complications, the uncertainty, all the things that would come with not walking away, and none of it felt simple, none of it felt safe, but it did feel right, in a way I could not explain. Then I guess it is a good thing I have never been very good at simple, I said, and there was a faint edge of something lighter in my tone now, not humor exactly, but something close to it. She glanced at me again, and this time there was no hesitation in her gaze, no searching, just recognition, not of memory, but of choice. You have not changed, she said quietly, and for once, I did not argue, did not correct her, because maybe she was right. Maybe the parts that mattered had never left, just been buried under everything else. Then we should not stand out here, I added, nodding toward a distant ridge where the terrain dipped into a series of natural formations that could offer better cover. If your people are already looking, we do not want. To make it easy, she followed my gaze, assessing the direction with a quick, practiced glance, then nodded once, decisive. Agreed, she said, and without another word, we started moving, not as strangers anymore, not as enemies, but not quite as allies either, something in between, something still forming, our steps falling into rhythm without effort, the distance between us close, but not restrictive, a balance that felt earned rather than forced, the ground beneath us firming as we moved, farther from the storm's path, each step carrying us forward into something unknown, but no longer uncertain. And as we walked, I realized something else, something quieter but just as important. I was not following her, and she was not following me. We were moving side by side, choosing the same direction, and that was new. That was something I had not expected to find out here, in the middle of everything that had already been broken. Ethan, she said after a while, her voice cutting gently through the steady rhythm of our movement. I turned my head slightly, acknowledging her without slowing. Yes, I replied. She did not look at me when she spoke next, her gaze fixed ahead, but there was something different in her tone, something steadier, more certain than before. When I said I would remind you, she began, I did not mean only of the past. I frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in curiosity. Then what did you mean? I asked, and she was quiet for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully, then finally answered. Of who you are when it matters. The words settled into place with a quiet finality, and I felt that same shift again, not pressure this time, not confusion, but clarity, the kind that does not come from remembering, but from understanding, and I nodded once, more to myself than to her, because for the first time since all of this began, I was not trying to figure out who I had been, I was deciding who I was going to be, and that made all the difference. The ridge rose ahead of us in a slow curve of dark stone and pale dust, its surface catching the light in sharp angles that reflected the quiet clarity of the sky above, and as we reached it, our steps slowed without needing to speak it, both of us feeling the same shift, the same moment settling into place, not an ending, not a pause, but something final in its own quiet way. I stopped first, looking out over the expanse beyond, the battlefield now distant, reduced to a faint scar along the horizon, and for the first time since this began, it did not feel like something I needed to leave behind. It felt like something that had led me here. Kalira came to a stop beside me, her presence steady, familiar now in a way that no longer needed explanation, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence no longer carrying questions, just understanding. This is far enough, she said after a while, her voice calm, grounded in the same certainty she had carried from the beginning, but softer now, shaped by everything that had changed between us. I nodded slightly, not because I was told, but because I felt it too, that this was the point where paths either split or became something else entirely. It usually is, I replied quietly, my gaze still fixed on the distance, the wind brushing lightly against my face, cool and steady, carrying no trace of the storm that had brought us together. She turned her head slightly, looking at me, not searching anymore, not questioning, just seeing, and I could feel it without meeting her eyes, that quiet recognition that had replaced everything else. You still do not remember, she said, not as a challenge, not as a disappointment, just as truth. I let out a slow breath, the air leaving my chest steady and unforced. No, I answered, and this time the word did not feel heavy, did not feel like something missing. It felt like something accepted. She studied me for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something that no longer needed proof. It does not matter, she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just clarity. I finally turned to look at her fully, meeting her gaze without distance, without uncertainty. It matters to you, I said, because that part was still true, still real. She held my gaze, her expression steady but warmer than it had ever been before. It mattered, she corrected softly. Now I understand something else. I waited, not because I needed the answer, but because I wanted to hear it, because whatever she said next would not be about the past. It would be about what we had become here, in this moment. You did not save me because you remembered me, she said, her voice quiet but certain. You saved me because that is who you are. The words settled into place with a kind of finality that did not close anything, but opened something instead, and I felt it, not as a memory returning, but as something aligning, something clicking into place in a way that did not need explanation. I gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in understanding, because she was right, not about the past, but about the choice, about the part that had never changed. Then I guess that is enough, I said, and for the first time, it truly was. She watched me for a second longer, then turned her gaze back to the horizon, the light catching in her eyes as she stood there. No longer just a warrior, no longer just a memory, but something more, something real. We will meet again, she said, not as a question, not as a hope, but as something inevitable. I did not ask how, did not question why, because some things did not need to be explained to be true. I just nodded once, simple, certain, and then I stepped forward, moving along the ridge without looking back, not because I was leaving her behind, but because I understood now that this was not where it ended, it was where it began. And as the wind carried across the open world, quiet and endless, there was no need for anything more, no final words, no grand declaration, just the steady rhythm of footsteps moving forward, and the quiet truth settling in between them, that he was never meant to conquer the stars. He was meant to remind them what hearts are for.